In early 2020, 7,000 workers operating around the clock built two massive field hospitals in Wuhan. Authorities delivered the structures in a matter of days. Millions followed the construction via livestream, while international observers pointed to the hospitals as proof of a top-down governance structure capable of absolute mobilization. This drive to build often accelerates in the wake of crisis. Following the 2011 Wenzhou train crash, the government responded by investing more into the high-speed railway network, layering new infrastructure over the failure. These projects exist on a scale distinct from global norms. Historically, China has directed 14% of its entire gross domestic product toward infrastructure. In the United States, that figure is closer to 2%. When we focus only on these massive physical outputs, we tend to follow the official narrative of a perfectly synchronized state. We see the concrete and the speed, but we miss the friction and the internal contradictions that actually make these projects possible. Most academic frameworks for studying infrastructure were built to analyze Western, neoliberal states, places where public and private, or state and society, are treated as distinct categories. Applying those same categories to China creates a distortion. It leads to the assumption that every road or dam is a direct, uncomplicated translation of a memo sent from Beijing. Analyzing infrastructure as a dynamic force reveals how it actively generates and reshapes political authority through its physical presence. To understand how the party state actually functions, we have to examine the unstable, everyday relationships between the people, the physical materials, and local politics. Infrastructure is often described as a passive foundation, the pipes and wires beneath a functioning society. A more accurate approach defines these projects as socio-technical assemblages. In this view, physical materials, human workers, and technical standards interact directly. Each element possesses its own agency, influencing the final behavior of the system. This creates technopolitics. Political outcomes emerge from the material properties of the project itself. How a bridge is designed or where a rail line is placed dictates social behavior and state power. The design and physical presence of a railway determine exactly how a population moves and how the state exerts its presence in their daily lives. Chinese infrastructure investment consistently runs ahead of actual economic demand because of the internal mechanics of the state. This is driven by the Tiaoquai system, a matrix where local municipalities compete for resources from vertical central ministries. Within the party structure, local officials compete for central funding to prove effectiveness, incentivizing constant large-scale construction. The incentives are clear. Every 1% increase in central transfers results in a 5% increase in local infrastructure spending. This creates massive domestic excess capacity. To offload the surplus of materials and labor, the state established international institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The sheer volume of construction we see is a structural byproduct of internal bureaucratic competition rather than a single, perfectly calculated master plan. Modern theories of control often begin with biopower, mechanisms targeting life and individual bodies. In China, state authority is increasingly exercised through infrastructural power, shaping the environments and grids that surround those bodies. This power determines who is authorized to move and what materials are prioritized by the state. Authority embeds in everyday provision systems, from municipal water and public transport to the Internet's digital architecture. Because the state governs through these complex material grids, it must rely on socio-technical systems that it can influence but never entirely command. Specific case studies show how these material systems produce outcomes that the central government cannot fully predict. In Kunming, the constant cycle of construction creates a massive flow of scrap materials. Migrant workers intercept these flows, building an independent economy outside the state's formal plants. The state also attempts to apply this infrastructural logic to nature itself through ecological civilization initiatives. By establishing strict ecological red lines, the state manages mountains and watersheds as a planned utility, coercing local communities whose livelihoods depend on these resources. Even digital connectivity produces friction. Expanding wireless networks into remote areas often manufactures socio-political isolation by prioritizing surveillance and state monitoring over community needs. This dynamic reaches its peak in Xinjiang, where commercial digital infrastructures have been absorbed into a carceral system. The state weaponizes existing corporate technology against an ethno-racialized class, turning commercial labor tracking systems into an archipelago of total institutions. In every case, the material properties of the infrastructure produce secondary effects, unplanned social realities that escape the state's original intent. Looking back at the Wuhan hospitals, the speed of construction reveals a complex web of technopolitics. That performance relied on the alignment of transnational supply chains, local migrant labor, and the reach of commercial live streaming platforms. This process of negotiation through concrete, steel, and data defines the practice of the China model. It functions as a localized, often contested effort to project power through the built environment. Analyzing these outcomes requires us to look past methodological nationalism, the assumption that everything the state builds is flawlessly orchestrated from Beijing. Policies like the Belt and Road Initiative are viewed as grand geopolitical strategy, mirroring the official image the state projects at its own summits. To understand the reality of global China, we must shift our focus to the local, material impact of the projects themselves. We have to examine the social and political relations that develop around these new bridges, ports, and data centers. The reality of Chinese statecraft is embedded in the unstable, everyday functioning of these physical systems.